Hello, my name is Rennie. Thank you for coming to my talk, Reconstruction, Our Body and Mind as Environments. Sometimes it takes a real breakdown in our social, cultural, even our mental health norms to transform into something that's better. It's almost like you break down to rebuild back up. In the last 2 years, we've experienced an unprecedented shift in our daily lives. We've had to change and reconsider our relationship with our families, our communities, but most importantly, we've had to reconsider our relationship with ourselves. How have our perceptions of selfhood changed? How is it that we are now reimagining our bodies, our minds, and surroundings? And how is it that we want to reintegrate back with our physical environments? My work addresses how we can manage the stressful conditions heightened by the pandemic on both an emotional and physical level. More specifically, my work enables me to confront my struggles with panic disorder, a condition in which one has to structure their life in particular ways to mitigate against a constant state of panic and anxiety. While there are several contributing factors to my anxiety disorder, for example, genetics, my conflicts with identity, my conflicts being a biracial woman, I'm mostly interested in exploring the environmental causes and how we can address mental health outside of our bodies. When we think about anxiety, we only think about the internal struggle and nature of it. Shaking, disorientation, nausea, dizziness, etc. We don't often think about anxiety as it pertains to our physical surroundings. By employing various everyday materials, I construct large-scale installations and assemblages that occupy interior spaces. In doing so, I explore different ways to represent and structure the nature of my lived experiences. All in all, my work is about the subconscious, but making it into a conscious physical existence. The designer does not begin with some preconceived idea. Rather, the idea is a result of a careful study and observation, and the design a product of that idea. I came into the program trained as a graphic designer and working professionally as a user experience designer specifically. As a designer, I am required to communicate in a highly controlled and regulated manner. Design work is about the user. It's about getting them from point A to point B as quickly and efficiently as possible. It's not about me, and I have to regularly remove myself from the work to communicate someone else's message. And while I think that works perfectly fine for me in my professional life, it was a detriment to my artistic practice early on. My early works were overtly constrained and controlled, and though I think I was unintentionally reflecting my mental health in terms of the structure I needed, it wasn't representing the inner turmoil and anxiety that I was trying to communicate. And to move on from this, I had to try and consider why it is I felt the need for this structure, not only on a technical sense of the work, but also emotionally. Why is it that I felt the need to constrain myself from the work, and how could I remove myself from that overt sense of logic and control? Logic is a complication. Logic is always wrong. It draws the threads of notions, words in their formal exterior, toward illusionary ends and centers. Its chains kill. It is an enormous centipede stifling independence. Married to logic, art would live in incest, swallowing, engulfing its own tail, still part of its own body, fornicating with itself, and passion would become a nightmare tarred with Protestantism, a monument, a heap of ponderous gray entrails. As I sought to remove myself from logic and order, I began to look at the work of the Dada art movement, specifically because their art emerged as a response to World War I, and they were explicitly rejecting logic and reason. Instead of trying to understand the nature of war and the hardships associated with it, they really leaned into the discomfort and embraced chaos, irrationality, and nonsense. These ideas and the general rejection of art in their work really fascinated me, mostly because I couldn't fathom that at the time. And as I started to look to break down my need for structure and looking for a better way to express the struggles of mental health, I started to acknowledge the things that I was constantly engaging with, which was an attempt to confront the sources of my anxiety rather than just avoiding them, and my attempt to start to bring my daily life into the work. I looked at imagery and materials around me that I could use to express myself in a less structured and constrained manner. Untitled 19 was my first attempt to move beyond my designerly aesthetics by collaging different materials that were a representation of things that I was regularly engaging with during lockdown, such as magazines, movies, cardboard from Amazon purchases, etc. Though this work still adheres to a confined rectangular format, this work began my attempt to break down the boundaries of logic, but also two-dimensional form. By adding materials that extended beyond the canvas, such as the dangling fabric, the attached woods, I was able to move outside the parameters of this rectangular format and canvas. Collaging really helped me remove myself from my preconceived boundaries and made me question the implications of working in two-dimensional form versus working in three-dimensional. And if I was going to continue incorporating materials of everyday life, how else could I be doing that? How can I continue to represent my life within art? I began to look at the work of Robert Rauschenberg, specifically his Combines. He believed his work existed between art and life and really wanted to emphasize the narrow space between the two. And with that, this particular work bed became a sort of intimate self-portrait in that it reflects his very personal life with his actual bed and his art. This really inspired me to think not only about the physicality of my work and the materials in my work, but how I could transform and destabilize the items that I engage with regularly, and how I can alter my anxiety and some of my conflicts with materiality and objects, maybe things in my home that I have negative associations with. So really, how could I take the items of my home and reimagine them into physical reflections of myself? My work gives a physical form to things our society does not let have a physical form. By using transformation as a fundamental aesthetic principle, I began to understand and perceive my works as a form of portraiture. Not simply portraiture in the sense of depicting external reality, but portraiture in the sense of representing internal or psychological experiences. My piece Renovation is a reflection of my troubled connection to my home. A door is meant to be an object of security, a barrier, opening only at the will of its owner. However, this particular door has a narrow crack right down the middle of it, which basically rendered it useless as a means of privacy and protection. The transparencies on the corners, the plexiglass in the bottom left, and the voids between the woods at the top right are meant to signify a false sense of safety and security. They remind us that even when we believe we are at our safest, we might actually be at our most vulnerable, which could be an unfortunate reality for those of us who grew up fearing the home and don't find it to be a safe haven of security that it's supposed to be. So as I continued to question how I addressed my mental health and my materials and this idea of security and privacy, I began to think a lot about surfaces and transparency in connection to my own mental health. How is it that I can use my materials and environments to evoke a sense of exposure, to really acknowledge the desire to protect myself from vulnerability, but to do so in a way where it is what it is. The human experience means having an external self, but it also means having a hidden internal self. And the internal self we can view as being unusual and gross and unworthy of love, whatever our hangups might be. So how do I take that internal conflict and let it live outside of me? How do I give something completely ephemeral the agency to exist in my physical space that I would otherwise let bottle up in my mind and in my body? Unfocusing the spectator's mind. The artist does not create something separate and closed, but instead does something to make the spectator more open, more aware of himself and his environment. Since I was forced to acknowledge my surroundings during COVID-19, I started reflecting a lot more about the home and sometimes my negative associations with it. My home and my upbringing played a significant role in my development for anxiety and panic disorder, and it suddenly became my primary source of comfort. This made me reflect and think about the interior works of Pierre Bonnard, especially because these paintings were more about his familiarity with his subjects in his home. He once stated he couldn't paint something that he hadn't spent enough time with. So for him, rather than capturing the objects themselves, it was the memory of the object that Bonnard wanted to reflect on. So instead of just trying to capture a household item, I wanted to capture the feeling of those objects as they pertain to distinctive experiences. Upside down chairs, broken and unusable lamps, torn fabric, moments that suggest unease within the household that a lot of us are familiar with, unfortunately. And once again, taking a non-physical impression in consciousness and making it into a physical, substantial moment. I'm continuously interested in this idea of storytelling that our walls and our objects can tell us. They can tell us something that may not be immediately evident. For me, I'm someone who easily disregards materials and objects if I feel like they don't have any inherent value. The abundance of stuff has always provoked my anxiety, but my practice has enabled me to reconsider how these items can be utilized outside of any predetermined notion of their usefulness, and has really allowed me to dictate my subconscious response to them by turning them into objects that are uniquely supportive and unapologetic in their own right. Another large consideration in how I approach my work with installations is the color. Color is dangerous. It is a drug, a loss of consciousness, a kind of blindness, at least for a moment. Color requires, or results in, or perhaps just is, a loss of focus, of identity, of self, a loss of mind, a kind of delirium, a kind of madness, perhaps. My work has always relied on color as the primary gesture for reflecting my anxiety. The vibrant colors of my work really demand attention. They're strong, bright colors, and they can feel energizing and attentive, but they can also irritate the eyes. I think about color in terms of the psychological reaction they can cause: alertness, unease, energy, alarm, etc. My two-dimensional works relied really only on color to suggest the impression of anxiety and panic. But as I explored more with materiality and installation, I wanted to utilize color outside of just applying paint. And this is when I became more fascinated with different applications of color, specifically light. As a painter, it was more natural for me to invoke energies with paint. I understand the feeling and emotions within works of Impressionists, for example: vibrant, dramatic colors, gestural and spontaneous brushstrokes, and emphasis on lighting and its environment. This can also be true of the light and space movement, creating ethereal and atmospheric experiences of light and color. With both Vincent van Gogh and James Turrell, the light, color, and movement are immersive and emotionally demanding in their own way. You can feel the emotion and the passion for life in Van Gogh's Sunflowers with the lively brushstrokes and yellow color. But in the same vein, Turrell's work focuses on the ephemeral experiences of light and color and plays with how this is seen and felt by the viewer. I really do find Turrell's use of space and illusion and perception to function really in line with traditional painting. In thinking of how I can invoke life and the conflicting energies outside of just traditional painting, light and the additional application of color allowed me to emphasize internal emotions that are layered, complicated, and viscerally overwhelming at times. Instead of just applying bold, attention-demanding color with paint, I could also use the element of light to require multisensory participation. With the inclusion of light, I am able to better place myself inside of the space, and I can further develop an understanding of my body in relationship to my environment and build upon my desire to create these type of physically demanding pieces. Heat is a manifestation of these ideas and is a combination of multiple energies. The work moves, it spills over, it disrupts the surrounding space, and it doesn't stop in one contained area. The sense of order and disorder blend together to create one interconnected mess of reality, which conveys the experience of me wanting that element of control, but also understanding and acknowledging the unbounded reality of my mind and my body. And as I move on for the program, I want to continue exploring the essence of diverse energies and experiences. How else can I document the unsettling nature of life, and how else might that exhibit itself in other spaces? Maybe not just the home, but also in the general public, or maybe semi-private spaces such as our offices. And as I move further on from the pandemic, I have really taken the opportunity to relearn my needs, to let go of boundaries and control that no longer serve me, and to learn to allow my body and mind to function as needed, even if it means changing my surroundings and my possessions accordingly. My studio practice has really allowed me to rebuild a physical relationship with myself and my environment tactfully, though my body and my mind will always remain in a constant state of struggle and adaptation. And I'll just close by saying that our bodies are not meant to be separated from our environments. And my work has really allowed me to establish this connection on my own terms. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you to my advisors and my mentors and the entire Lesley community.